Yeah, I'm going to try to go over this video and it's talking about robots and being compared to trans life or transgender people, and it kind of stuck with me. So I wanted to sit there and try to go
On
over
today's
it a little
episode, we're going to talk
bit.
about. Sorry, I always suck at these. That one looks familiar. Do you ever feel bad for your devices? Like, my PSP just wants to rest. In fact, the battery had already completely died on me once, but I brought it back to life. Shows, games, movies, etc. I feel like there's often a robot of some kind. Robots have been used to represent a lot of different marginalized groups throughout their use as an allegory, and usually they're viewed as less than human due to a variety of reasons. Depending on the kind of story you're telling, they'll either fight against this injustice or just remain subservient and fade into the background of the world. Of course, there can be connections drawn from robots to pretty much any marginalized group, but I personally was really curious about the parallels between them and being trans. I think there are a lot of different angles that this could be taken from, and it was really hard narrowing my focus, but I've come up with a few parallels between the way robots are used as an allegorical device to the overall trans experience. I'm not going to act like I'm some expert on robots and media. There are just so many examples that I would love to get into, but I just don't have the time to watch them all. So I enlisted some help from Twitter.com, as well as friend of the channel, Rel, robot fucker. I figured she would be the expert. You'll hear from her throughout, and I'll be referencing quite a few articles that guided my thinking, which as always will be linked in the description. This isn't meant to be a super in-depth, absolutely comprehensive video, rather just stuff I think is cool and wanted to share. Speaking of which, in almost every context in which robots are present, the discrimination against them plays a big role in how they're used and viewed in the story. Whether a narrative focuses on this discrimination depends on the work, and the extent of said discrimination also varies. To look at this through a trans lens, though, the big thing that stands out to me is being viewed as less than human. One of the most real, and honestly I'd say haunting examples of this is in the Animatrix The Second Renaissance, specifically Part 1. If you're not familiar, the basic idea of the short is that mankind created robots to do all the jobs they didn't want to do, so humans could live carefree lives. One day, a robot heard his owner was going to get him scrapped, leading to him rebelling and killing his owner. He gets put on trial, is convicted of murder, and then the consensus is that all robots need to be destroyed. There are then a number of scenes of humans relentlessly killing robots, and despite the fact that there is no bloodshed per se, it is incredibly gruesome. The scene where we see someone who is assumed to be a human woman then gets stripped of her flesh as she screams, "I am real," and getting killed for being a robot is kind of what sparked this whole idea in my head. Now, the Second Renaissance Parts 1 and 2 were actually partially written by the Wachowskis, who, if you don't know, both wrote and directed The Matrix along with the sequels. Why does this matter? Well, both Lily and Lana Wachowski are trans women, and I find it hard to believe that the scene in particular.
I didn't know the person who made Matrix was transgender. That's kind of new to me. But this video is going over all these topics, and with me making a robot doll, it kind of touched with me, and trying to sit there and say that if you're making a robot doll, I guess that somehow you're a closet transgender person, and I just don't see it. But I could see it because I see some of the points they're making, and it's kind of is relevant to how robot dolls are kind of being treated right now, with not being real, and somehow you're weird if you have one, and somehow under male gender roles you're not allowed to play with dolls as a man, and so forth. It kind of goes back to the hair band of the 1990s and 1980s and early 2000s, where men couldn't, where you always got accused of being gay if you like hair bands and you want to have your hair long, or you want to have earrings in your ears or whatnot, or paint your fingernails, and then you finally submit to normal rules, and so you kind of start taking, or you want to build robot dolls, and you just go back to the same gender nonsense as normal. But yeah, I can kind of see his point.
Particular was not influenced by that at least a little bit. Trans women, and especially trans women of color, are way more likely to be victims of homicide just off the basis of their identities. And on identities, the two words spoken in the scene, "I am real," are really indicative of how trans people often get their identities stripped away and are treated as less real in comparison to cis people. Overt violence and discrimination like this are very real issues that every trans person has to be aware of. And while I acknowledge this is a pretty heavy start to this video, I think it is incredibly important to have this sort of lens when talking about this kind of topic. To completely change the vibe, let's talk about that feeling of being less than and what that looks like in the context of robots. Growing up, unfortunately, I never watched my life as a teenage robot. It was a little bit before my time. So instead, I got to watch Fanboy and Chum Chum.
I think I was in my 20s when that Teenage Robot came out, but it made me feel really old.
Awesome. Anyways, I went back and watched a couple episodes for this video, and there are so many parallels to the trans experience here. The one that immediately stood out to me is how Ginny's mother always refers to her as XJ9, her model number, despite the countless time Ginny insists that she be called Ginny. She just wants to be and be.
Yeah, just like with my robot doll, everybody calls it an it, and so forth. So I thought that was kind of funny.
Seen as a normal girl, but due to factors out of her control, this is something that she really struggles with. Being outcast and bullied by some girls at school, being kicked out of a restaurant, and the list goes on. Even when she is able to fit in with her skin that makes her appear human, it's clear that it's not really her. As Rel puts it, there's also this alienation of not really fitting in with your cis peers. Even if you pass as cis, there's still this nagging feeling that you're not like everyone else, like you're a robot in disguise. In the same vein as Ginny,
And it's just like with a robot doll. People sit there and try to constantly insult you over it and constantly try to make insinuations about either you're being gay by being a man playing with a doll, or they want to go through some concept of objectifying women, and they can't actually decide which one it actually is, so they just sit there and just keep insulting for no reason at all. But yeah, I see his point.
there's Nano from Nichijou, who has a big key in her back, and she desperately wants it gone so she can blend in with the rest of the girls at school. And just like with Ginny, she learns that the people who really care about her don't care that she's different and help her learn to accept herself for who she really is. Now, trans mask robots. I asked a friend of mine. He said he couldn't think of anything that really stuck out to him. This article here mentions Sex from Battle Angel Alita. I haven't seen it. But I would go as far as to say that Rodney from Robots could be a contender. Hear me out. When his parents originally make him, they forget one final part, and it's kind of like implied what that part is. And secondly, there's this time where they made him wear this, and he didn't like that. So there's my case. If there's anything you can think of, please put it down below. I did get my friend to come around on Wall-E, and I don't even know why. I think the way the film explores the concept.
But I can sit there and see how people could sit there and live out what they can't do in real life through a robot doll. So I can see the point from an engineering point of view that if you can't be actually transgendered in real life, you could actually try to get through your mental acceptance through the robot doll instead. So yeah, people's discrimination does matter.
Concept between the separation of the body and the self is really powerful. I think the one word I would use with the film would be confinement. How real can Kusanagi be if her memories are designed and manufactured in the same way that her body? I feel like a lot of the common anti-trans rhetoric revolves around the idea that trans people lack some sort of empathy because of the mutilation of one's body. It takes, 5 seconds to disprove these claims.
Here he's talking about Ghost in a Shell, and that's actually a cyborg, not an android. But yeah, I could sit there and see how you could want to go Android since you can't go cyborg quite yet with our current technology, but I could sit there and see the implementation that basically the closest thing to a cyborg right now is being transgender. So I could sit there and see the parallelism between transgenderism and being a cyborg. But at least until we're able to put circuit boards actually in the human anatomy. But for right now, I can sit there and see how being a cyborg could be another word for transgenderism, and how transgenderism can actually play a part of the psychological discrimination of what a future cyborg might go through.
But at least in my personal experiences, I find people looking to demonize trans people often go back to the idea that our bodies are in some way unnatural. To them, it is not enough that I am real to myself. They want an explanation, some magical answer that never has and never will exist. And because of this, I feel like I'm written off a lot of the time. Many robots and media struggle with proving their sentience to the humans that created them, which often leads to them rebelling or becoming deviants. I guess what I'm trying to say is, much like a robot that questions its existence, trans people are often viewed as a creation of man. Because of some scientific anomaly, a glitch in the binary, this being that cannot be explained exists. And they want to fix that. Trans people are not a new...
Yeah, the normal people constantly want to try to tell you what you can or can't do, whether or not back in the day when we wanted to listen to hairband music and they wanted to tell us we couldn't have earrings or couldn't tell us we could have long hair, they would implement that somehow that was gay. So now we go on with the robots and stuff. Now they want to sit there and tell you you can't do that neither. So, and it's the irony between listening to this versus a bunch of women standing there in a pair of pants telling men they can't wear dresses while they're standing in a pair of pants, just like that girl who's in Congress right now complaining about the transgender congressperson using the bathroom, even though she's sitting there saying that men shouldn't be in girl spaces, even though she brags about going to the Citadel, which meant that her entire college education was based on her invading an all-male military academy other than the Citadel, which means that she implemented a male space, even though she wants to run her entire career on whether or not men can go into female spaces, even though there's a big difference between a straight male doing that versus a transgender person doing that. But I can sit there and see how people get discriminatory.
Thing. People like to act like they are, but it's just not true. Individuals have been seeking ways to change their gender forever. Only now is a mainstream political debate that wants to forbid both trans and cis people from life-saving medical care. Now, trans people relying on cis people to receive medication or surgeries is something that really stuck out to me in relation to robots relying on humans for maintenance or new parts. However, Rel provided another perspective that I think is just as interesting. As they say, in my experience, I've always seen it more as trans people helping out other trans people to receive medical care. I can definitely see the connection being made between robots/trans people's identities not being taken seriously or just outright rejected, because bigots can easily make the excuse that we're not the genuine thing to their standards. I think depending on your own lived experiences and outlook on things,
just like people want to sit there and say that you don't have a real girlfriend if you have a robot doll, or you even have a sex doll, and they want to constantly make jokes about that. But yeah, and then if people sitting there going through transgenderism get completely janked on not being a real girl, but they do the same thing to sex dolls, even though Planned Parenthood still hasn't acknowledged sex dolls yet. But they want to try to act like they want to do transgenderism, but by this entire argument, the people with sex dolls are kind of in the closet transgender people and stuff, and it just don't really make a lot of sense to me when there seems to be a lot of hypocrisy in this.
either one of these might ring more true, or you might have a completely unrelated different perspective. As someone who's gone through the medical system here in the United States, it pretty much just turned into me hoping the cis doctors I was talking to would take me seriously enough to check a little box on a sheet. And I only made it to that position because I was over 18 and in a state that let me. Even then, it still took what felt like ages telling doctors over the phone way too many personal details that I never wanted to share. On the flip side, I know there's a lot of communities both online and in person that will help trans people in need. A lot of the friends I have made have received their care because of these communities pointing them in the right direction, and that's great. Let's connect this to Robots 2005. Now, where the parallel falls apart just a little bit is the fact that there's actually no humans in the film. So let's just use the big bad guys as a stand-in. Bigwell Industries, headed by Ratchet, takes away every robot's rights to exchange parts and repair each other, instead just pushing expensive upgrades for the sake of profit. Rodney steps up and because of his talent for fixing and love for his community, is able to fix robots who otherwise might have ended up dead, and teaches others how to perform their own repairs. Robots 2005 hates capitalism, hates big pharma, and loves trans people. I think that's what I took away. Anyways, I feel like this is a really interesting angle in its own right, and you could probably make a whole video on that in itself, but now I want to talk about my personal favorite topic, relationships. First, it's important to check up on your relationship with the subscribe button. You know, 95% of my viewers aren't subscribed, and I think I've seen this meme so many times, but I've never actually read what it said. Anyways, the way robots are viewed and treated in terms of sex and relationships really bears a lot of resemblance to how trans people are viewed and treated in these same contexts. Looking at Blade Runner 2049 and really a lot of these cyberpunk-esque films, games, etc., we have a lot of robots that appear female, usually for the purpose of hooking up with. In a lot of works, hooking up with a robot, typically one that is femme-presenting, is seen more as a fringe, fetishy thing, and is generally looked down upon. Falling in love with a robot is almost always completely out of the picture or seen as incredibly pathetic. Now, the sexualization of female code...
Incredibly pathetic is what he sit there and said, and yeah, that's true. That they want to sit there and try to insult you if you want to sit there and have a robot doll or a sex doll and so forth, and I can see how this plays into the transgender topic. But yeah, I mean, you can't sit there and say that somehow people who have sex dolls ain't somehow figuring that if it's not about the sex, then it probably is some type of subconscious transgender thoughts, since transgenderism, or how transgender you are, is a scale of like 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, and some people might just fall one in that 1 to 2 spot or a 10 to 20 spot. They're not as high up as a 9 or a 10 on transgenderism, or a 90 or 100. So the people on a lower scale ends up going more with a robot doll for getting their ideas out and better express themselves instead of going full-blown transgenderism, since most of them probably really ain't gay, don't see themselves as gay, but still likes the female aesthetic and would probably be putting the makeup on and long hair on and all that too. If they could, they would, but since people are discriminatory and are jerks, then you can't really do that, so you end up doing it with a robot doll instead to try to meet people in the middle, but then they turn around and they even go up against that too and tell you can't do that neither. So yeah, I can see it.
Loaded robots might be a topic for another time, but I do think it's really interesting how, despite the fact that robots are inherently sex and genderless, we still apply these things to them. A male robot can quite literally be anything, while a female robot is usually overtly sexualized and has an extra layer of being othered on top of the otherness that already comes with being a robot. This all ties back to the idea.
Well, maybe because the female robot is actually the male engineer's ability to actually do things he's not allowed to do in real life, with people having male roles and male gender assignments and ain't allowed to actually do that themselves, so they do it through a robot doll instead. And so it ends up being the females over sexualized and stuff, because maybe it's not the stuff that he's allowed to do himself with the people's actual discriminatory thoughts, and it's supposed to free America.
Idea of how trans people, a lot of the time trans women in particular, are viewed in terms of relationships. As Rel put it, dating a robot can be seen as fake/not real by bigots, the same way that they say dating a trans girl doesn't mean you're dating a real girl. It all comes back to them demanding something real or genuine in their limited worldview. They do not live in reality, yet they demand everything conform to the fantasies in their heads. The same way female robots are.
But as people who are just wanting to be judgmental and they want to tell other people what to do, and especially with the rise of Christian nationalism, it's going to even get worse now, since people actually voted the church back into power, and we're going to get a whole lot more judgmental jerks that sit there and tell other people what they're not allowed to do.
Are fetishized and seen as one-night stands, link back to a lot of trans women's experiences while trying to date, usually being disregarded as nothing more than a fetish or not someone you could ever have a serious, genuine relationship with. Having to worry that your cis part.
Or it could just be them trying to express themselves and do things that they're not allowed to do in real life, and it's more than just a fetish. It might be a challenge of actually building robots, an actual challenge of doing the art and stuff, and we should take in consideration that it is art. And people might want to express themselves through the art, and maybe the act of transgenderism is doing art too, and it really just comes down to whether or not you see yourself as gay or not, or maybe it's straight men who just like the art and just thinks it's pretty too. I remember being in like 7th grade and going to the principal's office because they told me I couldn't wear fingernail polish going to school. And they just imply that it's gay or being raised, and my dad used to tell me that if you wear an earring in your right ear, then it makes you gay, and so forth. And it just doesn't stop, so now, even as an adult, they come up with something else, and they're always going to come up with something else, and now they're going after the dolls too, since they can sit there and tell us how to dress and what gender roles we're allowed to have, even though every girl I know is walking around in a pair of breeches and bragging about going to all military academies.
Partner sees you and the way you see yourself is really frustrating and sometimes really demotivating. I think this worry is one of the biggest reasons T for T is so popular, and why dating and relationships can be really hard for gender non-conforming people. Shifting gears, laugh. How does one define...
Maybe dating is hard because we were raised in all Christian families, we were raised in all Christian churches, and we were told as kids that dating is evil and of the devil, and to be right, you chose not to be able to date, and you just kind of got into that pattern in life, and it makes you kind of antisocial in a way. But to sit there and say that you have problems dating, it gets to a lot more detailed than just breaking it down on something in such a simplified manner.
Family. Family is something I feel no two trans people have similar thoughts and experiences with. Hell, even if they're from the same one. The idea of the nuclear.
But two transgender people sit there and have the same thoughts and so forth, but that's only assuming that you're defining transgender as transgender. And if you believe that there's a scale of how transgender or how gay you are, or so, it can be very much on a wide scale, and that's, if you got a scale of 1 to 100, that's 100 different possibilities of how you could be able to perceive that. And to sit there and only break it down to 2 different ways by the very people who are claiming that it's more complex than that, but yet they want to turn around and try to break it down that either you're absolutely transgendered, or you're absolutely not, or you're absolutely gay, or you're absolutely not. And if you're not, then you got to be completely male classified and completely male role, dress role is what they want you to do, and it's just kind of nonsense. I mean, people have different choices in life, and people have different decisions in life, and what works for one person might work something different for somebody else.
Their family consists of a mom, a dad, a kid or two, and maybe a dog thrown in there, all living under one roof happily ever after. This, at least in the United States, is the sort of standard you're supposed to live up to. Of course, there's nothing wrong with wanting that for yourself, but when you start projecting that belief onto those who don't want that, that's where the problems start. Queer relationships a lot of the time,
when you're enforcing it on somebody else, and that's when you're enforcing it somebody else, and you're putting your own ideas on somebody else. But yet that's what we constantly do right now, and that's what they want to do, is sit there and enforce their ideas on other people. And I thought we were better in that in modern America.
don't conform to that structure. Like, me and my wife can't figure out who the dog is going to be. But even if yours does conform to that, you're still going to be viewed as non-genuine. Moving away from building a family of your own, where does one turn if their own biological family isn't in their life? Well, this is where the concept of chosen family comes into play. Looking at Robots 2005 again, this film is genuinely so good. While Rodney is on good terms with his parents, in order to truly build a life for himself, he creates close bonds with the other rejects of Robot City. There's some family structure involved, like Aunt Fanny being the mother and this red guy being the weird brother, but to put it simply, family is who you choose to make it. A robot doesn't really have biological parents, besides one example, but we'll get there. And a lot of the time in media, robots band together and build their own communities, making a place where they'll be accepted and treated like everyone else. A place free from the hierarchies put in.
Yeah, and we're probably going to have to have certain communities where we get to have robot dolls, because normies won't let us do that without being judgmental. And we're going to probably end up having half complete districts just designed for robot dolls, unless the Christian nationalists get what they want, the normies get what they want, and they just outlaw it all, because they're just jerks like that. But I can sit there and see where we're going to have our own communities of like-minded people who want to support each other. And I just don't really see that happening quite yet, and it just goes into a whole nother topic.
Placed by human society, a place where they can truly live. Even if we don't know each other super well, I consider my local queer community as a sort of second family. We look out for each other, we help each other, and we really do care about one another. Later on, 2049 presents a really interesting view on how hierarchies of power are established and maintained. A replicant gave birth, something that should not be possible. And if that info got out, it would cause a massive uprising and throw power dynamics between humans and replicants completely on their head. One concept I've been learning about a lot recently is that of reproductive justice. Who is encouraged to reproduce, who is barred from it, and how are those voices silenced? There's a lot of intersectionality between race, gender, social class, etc., but when a people is able to populate on their own, this is where they truly gain power and independence. Queer folk, a lot of the time, can't have their own biological children, and that's one way a lot of hateful rhetorics.
And not all people can have biological children. I mean, so how can you force everybody to be part of the same infrastructure if not everybody can have their own biological children?
Leaks into society. To close on a less serious note, something, Wally and Eve are T for T, and you can't tell me otherwise. Now, this tweet here stirred up a little bit of controversy when it was published a while back, but I really think the process of unlearning what you were taught and finding meaning in yourself is really interesting. The first robot that came to mind when I originally saw this was Aegis from Persona 3. I'll try to keep this section pretty spoiler-free. When you originally meet her, she is very robotic, go figure, and she was quite literally built for one purpose: destroying shadows.
I never saw this before, so I have no idea what this character is.
She eventually fails to fulfill her mission, and she is absolutely devastated, until the members of SEES come together and help guide her through what it means to have purpose in life. By the end of the game, you kind of forget she's a robot. Her speech becomes less noticeably robotic, she tends to add to conversations more often, and overall just feels a lot more human after all said and done. Looking at this through specifically a trans femme lens, the idea of being raised to be a weapon can relate back to the core of toxic masculinity and how one is brought up to be a quote-unquote man. Obviously, everyone's experiences with this are different, and I'm not trying to call out all cis men or anything like that, but I still want to explore this idea because, well, I mean, that's why you're here. Okay, that should cover all my bases. Whew. In my own personal experiences, growing up in the Midwest, a man's purpose is to find a wife, have a good job, be tough, keep things to himself, and
The gender role of what men are. I mean, that's pretty much what he's talking about. That being able to be raising girls and become a weapon is still against all things the feminine, even though they call themselves feminist. But they'd rather sit there and see themselves as a weapon than to sit there and see them as sexy. So, yeah, but then they want to complain about nobody wanting to have kids anymore. And basically, you're somehow wrong if you want to build robot dolls to be sexy and not be a weapon. But even though that all of our robots right now are being built to be weapons, I mean, it's a topic that probably needs more in-depth.
be against going to the doctor for some reason? The list goes on, and you've heard it all before. Now, speaking to you as a trans woman, that didn't really jive with me, but that doesn't mean I sure didn't try to live like that. I don't know how my girlfriend put up with me. I was always so negative and sad and angry, and for what? I don't even really know, but I know I was encouraged to be angry by the men in my life. I remember being told in a car ride by some old guy in my family that your wife should never feel like she has more power over you, and thinking, do you even love your wife? I was like 14 when he...
I mean, people probably shouldn't be able to say that a wife shouldn't have more power over you, but yet they're the ones always talking about they want to protect women and they want to stand up for women, but yet they still want to dominate the women and stuff. And apparently the person has this channel is apparently trans. I don't know much about that. I'm not gay myself, but I can sit there and see some of the stuff he's saying, how transgenderism kind of symbolism with robots. But yeah, but how can you sit there and say that you're against these stereotypes if you're not actually supporting the doll community too? I mean, especially with Planned Parenthood that still hasn't acknowledged it.
Said that, and I still thought it was weird. Still, I bought into this line of thinking because, well, I was already mad at myself enough. Why not make it everyone else's problem? One thing led to another, and boom, now I'm here making YouTube video essays for the gay people on my phone. But removing myself from that mindset to truly have personal growth took a long time. I think being able to strip yourself from harmful/bigoted mindsets and learning to be more empathetic to your fellow human, as well as being free to express who you really are inside, makes you more human too. I think what Rel brings up here is really important. You don't have to
But being able to express who you are inside and being able to do that through robotics, especially with the ability how they kill hairband stuff, and maybe that the people really aren't gay still have some way to be able to express themselves through doll robotics instead, but yet we somehow still haven't went through that yet as a society. But I can still see how this could end up being that, but I don't see how anybody having a robot doll somehow needs to come out of the closet either.
trans your gender to figure out that your previous mindset wasn't the greatest. You just need to put yourself in someone else's shoes and truly try to view things from different angles. A character like Aegis, I think, embodies this in a really upfront way. She doesn't believe her life has any purpose other than fulfilling her preset goal. But in the end, it's her humanity that allows her to connect to those around her and derive her own purpose in life. Being trans is a lot like that in a sense. I was raised and expected to be some successful, tough man with a family of his own. Meanwhile, I made a puppy girl joke like 5 minutes ago, and I say this is my job. But this has allowed me to figure out what I like doing, and I was never so sure of myself until I actually started to be myself. What did we learn today? I think the big takeaway is that using robots as an allegory for a lot of different marginalized groups has often been a means of representing real-life problems that people aren't quite
Like the marginalized groups and maybe people who like rubber dolls that still hasn't been able to get any attention from anybody.
ready to see yet. Stories involving robots often deal with themes of identity, bodily autonomy, discrimination, relationships, families, etc., and these are the same sorts of struggles that are ever present while trying to exist as a trans person. So while I doubt very many stories involving robots were made with a trans perspective in mind, it's kind of inevitable that you'll see so many trans people relating with different robots wherever you look. Without much actual representation on the big screen, Allegory is the primary way these kinds of stories can be told without getting called woke. Personally, if you couldn't tell by that whole last section, I find myself really resonating with Aigis' growth throughout the story of Persona 3, and she's a big reason I consider Persona 3 my favorite game of all time. Even if there's no one robot that you would look at and be like, OMG, they're so mean, there's aspects within each of their stories that ring true depending on who you are and what stage of life you're at. It's never too late to keep growing, so might as well try, right? Big shout out to Rel for giving their inputs on this. It's been a really rough last couple of weeks, and getting to talk about
Well, all I can sit there and say is we got a lot of work to do and where we actually end up getting with robots. But yeah, I mean, maybe trans people need to be taken care of better, but people who buy and support robot dolls need to be taken better, and the people who even just straight up just get the sex dolls of the silicone sex dolls need to be looked at better. And people have different choices in life, and people have different things they're up to, and you don't know where anybody's come from or what somebody's going through and why they might need to have that in their life. And stop being a completely judgmental jerk to people around you, and maybe we need to care about each other instead of judging each other all the time and just trying to be mean to each other. Maybe we need to love each other instead of being mean to each other all the time, and care about what people are going through. And it's just a really bad idea to start telling people what they can or can't do in a free country. I'm going to leave it at that, but I thought this was an interesting idea, and maybe we can grow from it. Okay.